must constantly look at things in a different way.
The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast was created by two physical therapists out of the desire to learn more about the different educational roles in physical therapy and healthcare, and how healthcare education works by talking with educational leaders and people with different perspectives within physical therapy and across interdisciplinary lines on how education can be improved to disrupt the status quo of healthcare education. This is our journey, and thanks for listening. Are you a third-year physical therapy student that excels on tests when you have study guides, checklists, and deadlines? With all of the information available about how to prepare for the NPTE, it's easy to get disorganized and not feel prepared going into the big day. NPTE Prep Success is an online course that provides PT students easy-to-use study guides and step-by-step guidance through the NPTE preparation. To learn more, visit kylericeprep.com. Thank you again all for your continued support, and now for the show. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Powen, and for this episode, we have a tremendous guest to talk about a lot of things fun regarding academics, but also some other options that people can get involved in outside of academics. As today, I'm so thrilled and humbled to welcome the one and only Dr. Lindsay Padilla. Now, before I get into doing a little brief intro into who she is, I first and foremost want to give a personal shout out and huge thanks to our good friend Karen Litzy for recommending Lindsay to us for this episode. So Karen, thank you so much. You do some great stuff. Now, I realize, guys, that there's some of you out there that are listening, like, who's this Lindsay person you're speaking of? I'm like, I will give you a little intro, and then I'll let her introduce herself in a sec. So Dr. Lindsay Padilla is the ex-professor turned entrepreneur behind Build a Better Beta, which is an online program that helps influential experts release courses to their audience quickly and easily so they can focus on their teaching. Now, the Better Beta framework was born out of her tenure track years teaching adults online at a community college and the ridiculous amount of learning she's done in all things education. She is also the rambunctious host of the Academics Mean Business podcast and community. And it's a really, really fun and really enlightening podcast. I highly recommend you check it out and check out the show notes for it. The link is there because I've definitely learned some interesting things from it and heard some very interesting insights, which I'm sure we'll dive into in a little bit. But Lindsay, thank you so much for coming on the show today. And, I really respect and value all that you've done and what you're aiming to do with everything, as, everything that you've done is fantastic. Now, I'm kind of curious. I gave a little bit of a brief intro to kind of your story, but I know that doesn't do it justice at all. And, so for our listeners out there, they're kind of like, okay, how'd she become an entrepreneur? Like, what's her story here? Would you be willing to kind of share some background into your story and how you got involved with academics to kind of where you are now doing your own thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a journey, as is life. But thank you for having me, Brandon. This is so fun. I love the intersection of our worlds, and I feel like the ideas that we can share even outside of, different industries and platforms, I think is so valuable. And I think that's what's so cool about, social media and podcasting is just getting us to connect. Because I would never have even thought that I could impact healthcare educators or even physical therapists, as I was on Karen's show as well. So it's been really cool to kind of step out of that and be like, oh yeah, I do have some insights around, following a traditional path. With every intention of, being a professor forever, and then kind of going and doing this little diversion. And if there's any way to help a fellow academic or someone who's struggling with like what maybe they really want to do, if I could just, share a little bit about that, like what I've done, it just feels like, oh, that's my responsibility to talk about that. So yeah, it's funny because, I pretty much loved teaching growing up as a kid. I kind of like to hear myself talk. So that's why I started a podcast and became a professor. I don't know, teaching fits into that, but I've always loved teaching and I knew I would follow that path. And, I decided to go into community college and to teach community college. And I thought I found my dream job, and it was a wonderful job. So I wasn't trying to escape anything, which is common in the entrepreneur space. There's a lot of people escaping their 9 to 5. It didn't feel like escaping for me. It just felt like a way for me to play bigger is really what comes out in my story. And so I'm a happy professor. I just defended my dissertation. I have my tenure track job. I was about, when I left, I was a year and a semester away from tenure. My husband left a semester away from tenure.
Wow.
But he's a side tangential story. We had the two body problem as academics. We actually both landed tenure track jobs in a livable driving distance from each other, which was so cool. So we made it, right? Like by all measurements, we made it. And we're like living in affording California and bought a house. I mean, all of this stuff. And I basically woke up realizing that when my dissertation was over, which was kind of the last piece of the puzzle, I got my job the same semester I was finishing my dissertation. That fall semester was my first semester as a tenure track professor. So I all of a sudden have this writing practice, this morning writing practice I was doing. I all of a sudden have this space. And I was like, well, what do I need to do? And as a community college professor, we were kind of talking about this. We don't have to do research. It's not expected. It's not a part of our tenure expectations. In fact, it's more focused on teaching and service to the college. So I didn't have to, publish or do research. And so I was like, what do I want to do? And instantly I turned actually to health. I was like, oh, I've kind of been going outwards. I haven't gone inwards. Like, what does Lindsay need? And so I started working out, and I did it using a network marketing product. So I was a Beachbody coach. I became a Beachbody coach after my dissertation was defended because I was working out regularly in the morning using this product, and it did exactly what it promised, and it totally blew me away. And I was a new person in like a semester. I was happy. I was feeling amazing. I had all this energy. And of course, I'm going to connect it to this product and the community that it was around. And so I started to sell it and didn't think anything really of it. And then I remember the month I hit $1,000, it was, probably like 5 or 6 months into it. And I was like, oh, this is nice. We can actually update the house. And that side income was now like, oh, making money or feeling comfortable with like your budget and your expenses is not just about like not buying Starbucks so you can like put money into retirement. It's actually about also looking at income streams. Like, how can you add income streams? And it was something I'd never thought about before. And so that summer, once I like kind of realized that and it was enjoying Beachbody, I started to, as an academic does, I guess, like research outside of my downline or upline or whatever it's called, where they're training me how to like build a business. And I was like, I wonder what like other people are saying. So I started to listen to podcasts. Pat Flynn is one of them, and Amy Porterfield, and of course, Chalene Johnson, and all these people who were like, this is how you build an online business. And it's just little seeds were starting to be planted. That exchange was a realization for me where I'm like, oh, I don't need to depend on this MLM, this multi-level marketing company, to run a business. And so then it became this thing that was bigger than me. There's a little piece to that story as well where I basically buy a product. I bought my first course. And so I was like, if I'm going to do this, I want to learn from someone who's done it before me. So I bought my first product, and in that network of buying that product, I went to a live event, and there was a very popular blogger and a 6-figure course creator, meaning like she's making multiple 6 figures by selling digital products. And she was like, I wish my students finished my online course. If they finished this Pinterest course, I know how much it would change their business. And I was like, oh, well, how do you have it set up? And I just started talking to her about how she set up her course. And she's like, and I don't know what I said, but something was like, I never thought about it like that. And she looks me in the eyes and she's like, why aren't you telling everyone this? And I was like, oh, you guys don't know how to teach. I was like thinking I had to health coach because that's where I started my journey. And so it was from there, and that was in like April of 2016. That was it. Then it was, oh, I can help people with all my years of education. It now all makes sense. My years of teaching online, I can help entrepreneurs teach better. Like everyone has a course, like almost. It's a very common, product to have in your arsenal as a business online. And so from then on, it was like, that's what I do. And that skyrocketed. And by the end of that year, so April to December 2016, so coming up on 2 years, is when I left teaching. So it was that quick that I was able to make that decision. So the path was like, I never thought I would do that. I was not searching for it. I was not uncomfortable in my business my academic life. I actually was in a really great place with it, but I just realized like, oh, there's this ceiling that I have on my income when I have a salary, and the business was like infinite possibility and people that I could help and serve versus just my students that I had every semester. So it was it became about that impact.
That's interesting. I mean, that's such an interesting story with how that went through. And I'm kind of curious because you said once you had that event and you were like light bulb, and then it kind of made that change. How did your transition out of academia go? Like pretty good, or because I know that's something that I feel like a lot of faculty would be kind of worried about if they like want to do that. They're like, gosh, how do I do that peacefully?
Yeah, so there's a couple things, and I've learned a lot too, because I have my own experience, but I've also learned a lot from my guests who've also left. I mean, most of it was lies and stories I was telling myself about leaving, because it's our identity. I mean, I worked really hard to get there, and here I was walking away from something that people would, give an arm and a leg for, that was the dream. And so, but then that realization was like, oh yeah, but there's something bigger. And maybe that dream, that was one stepping stone to something bigger. And so the transition itself, like making the decision. So that summer, my husband said to me in August, we were about to go back, and he's like, you probably shouldn't have even gone back this semester. Like, you probably should have just left. Like, we're going to lose all this money. Like, is how he was seeing it. Cause he's like, if you're not in it full time, like, just imagine what it will happen when it's full time. But I kind of was like, well, first of all, I'm not going to do that to my faculty. Like, call them up the day before. Yeah, I'm not coming in. Sorry for those, 7 classes.
That just goes that would go so well.
That would be a different story. But no, I didn't. And I needed closure. I kind of wanted to do it one last time, I think. Like, I wasn't ready to not go back after summer break, So I think by mid-September, we were playing around with the idea of him leaving as well. No, I asked him, do you want to leave too? And he's like, well, I should stay. And we would stay on his healthcare, and he would get tenure, actually. And this really bananas contract came across my table, $60,000 to do a course. And I called Derek from my office when I got that call. And I was like, so my salary was just offered to me to create a course for somebody. And I was like, do you want to leave with me? And from then on, it was like, this is big. And it was easy then for me. Well, it was scarier for me to say I was leaving than it was for my husband. He was like, okay, bye. And I guess everyone was cool. But I was like, what? You told your faculty before me? Like, you don't have a job unless you don't have anything unless it's I come with you. So we kidded about that. But like, when I told people that I was leaving, I was nervous like that they would think bad about me. Like, oh my gosh, how could you do that? Like, why would you do that? Or, that's scary or really risky. And everybody was like, oh, that's awesome. Or like, you're brave. Like, there were a lot of people that were like, that's really brave of you, actually. And someone else was like, oh, why didn't I wish I figured that out. Like, or what did they say? You figured it out, like, go. Like, someone else was like, can you take us with you? Are you hiring anybody? And so, everyone was really receptive to it. I think the hardest people to tell were my students, actually. It was a weird moment where I waited a long time, actually, to tell them. And because students want to sign up for your next class, the next semester, and they're wondering what you're teaching. And I told them, and I think in one of the classes, I actually teared up a little bit, but I also realized someone reframed it back to me that like, it's actually cool to have a teacher do something different because it shows students that they can make those decisions for themselves at any point. And so they have a lot of professors that stay and are amazing. And, me doing a different path could also have an impact on them. So I like, I was good at my job. I'm not going to lie. Like, I was a good teacher. Like, people really enjoyed my classes and I really felt connected to them and to the curriculum and to what I got to teach. I loved it. But there was a little bit for me internally, and it's something I've been processing for the last 2 years, where I felt like there was some abandonment stuff happening, where I felt like I was leaving behind these students that I know I was helping. I mean, I'd get those emails and they'd message me, or they'd be in their office, or, just thanking me. And to leave that behind, it felt like, oh, but who's going to teach them? Which is super ego centered, but like, it's true. Like, who else? Like, there's no me. Like, and so, so the identity stuff, that's actually what basically gave, birthed my podcast, was this idea of like, am I the only one that's felt like this? And when I started to see, people with PhDs and like all these like advanced degrees in my space, I was like, oh, I wonder what they think about what's going on. And so that's where the podcast came from. And just having those conversations about what was going on inside, like internally for me, has been really healing. So my podcast has been a really healing thing for me, to just like have conversations with other folks who felt like I did.
Yeah. It's interesting because, when we first started off too, I never thought a few months beforehand, if someone said, you're going to have a podcast in a few months, I've been like, no, I'm not. Are you serious right now? But it's been amazing. I definitely think, at least from myself, I've underestimated how much I've grown and how much it would help me grow. And I really didn't expect that. So it's been quite an interesting turn of events. And I'm sure you've learned a lot as well. And, I'm curious, like, I'll back up a little bit here. So you had kind of mentioned some of these other things regarding transition, like sharing your story and kind of what you were going through. Just because I know there's a fair bit of our listeners out there, they're probably listening and they're maybe contemplating, they're like, should I stay? Should I go? Based on what you've learned, I mean, from your personal experience, but also kind of what you've learned from your awesome guests you've had on, what are some really good tips or some questions that someone should ask themselves to see, should I do something different, or, should I stay within academia?
Yeah. So I think some core questions, like, well, a pattern that I've noticed on the podcast, and I just did an interview a few hours before this with somebody who it's a little bit in my story, but not really. A lot of my people have something happen in their life, like a child is born, or an illness, or moving, something outside that basically makes them realize that like they don't have as much control over like their life as they thought they did. And I think one common thing, and this might be something a lot like familiar for your industry and your work as well. It's like, I became a professor because of the stability. I chose it because I wanted that like consistent income and the salary and the healthcare and tenure and like, and it had freedom tied to it. Like that's why I did it. And so we choose that. And then, and you can see politically what's happening, right? Like they're chipping away at our healthcare and they're chipping away at tenure, and like lots of stuff is happening politically that is making people realize like, well, this might not be like this forever. Like, yeah, I have tenure, but like, what if I don't anymore? Or what if my school shuts down? There was a guest I had who was a president of a university, and they had to close it, right? Because it was a private one. And so you never know, right?
Yeah.
So I think having a plan B or like some sort of side hustle isn't a bad idea in this economy. And it can come from a place of just like creative outlet, and like this podcast is for you, like where you kind of just do it out of, oh, I'm serving and helping people. So a lot of academics that I interview have blogs. That's pretty popular for an academic to have, right? Twitter tied to that is a typical academic kind of setup or whatever, but like there's other mediums as well. So podcasting is obviously another amazing one. And so, there are ways that you can start to generate, a following, if you will, of people listening, of people who are like, oh, I can learn from this person, that then could potentially be monetized. So if you're, you love knitting in your like spare time, like what could you help someone do that? Like, would you want to make some course videos? Like you really could do anything. Like, and from the academic perspective, we talk about this a lot on the podcast, but there's, we have a lot of skill sets that are really valuable to being an entrepreneur. And so the idea that we write well and communicate effectively, and we have that level of professionalism, but we also come with credentials and degrees, and we know how to do research, and we know how to organize and, finish a project. And there's lots of little things that are really important in business that we're good at. So it's just figuring out maybe what the vehicle is. So if you're in that phase of well, I'm not really sure if I want to go all in on this, and then to me, I would say just start playing and not really being tied to an outcome yet, because that exploration might make you have that aha moment like I did, where you're not really looking for an alternative, but you're playing. But if you are looking for an alternative, which does come up, like something's happening in your family or your life or whatever, I mean, there's so many resources online that can get you started quickly. And that's what the cool thing is about the era that we live in, is it's really easy to start a business. It may not be easy to get first buyers, but so much of it can be done on almost $0. And, having a PayPal link and, having a service and basically communicating and solving a problem to, a person, it's pretty easy. So there's not a lot of risk involved. When I was thinking about what it meant to start a business, I was always thinking about product based or brick and mortar, 10, 20 years ago. That's what business meant to me. And now that that's not what it is, and the tools that we have where you can throw up a Squarespace website in a couple hours, it's pretty easy. And so I would just play in that idea of recognizing that it's easy and let yourself explore that. And so you asked what kind of questions would you want to be asking? I think it's what do you want your day to look like? What do you want out of your life? What do you enjoy? What part of your work do you enjoy, and what part do you not? Is it commuting? Is it the long hours? Is it standing? I mean, whatever things it is, I would just start to say what would it look like if I could reinvent that? What would the optimal version of me be, and how could I basically design a business that fits that? And that's what I want people to realize, is that that's available to you. You could decide that it looks different, that you don't have to do it the way maybe your peers are doing it or colleagues, because there's just so much opportunity. Right.
No, I think that's a really, really good point. And you had kind of mentioned earlier, you feel like you had a lot of strengths from being academician and transferring to entrepreneurship, but I want to kind of play devil's advocate on that one.
Sure.
Because, what do you think are there certain traits that you found that academics on the whole have that maybe make it more difficult when it comes to entrepreneurship?
Of course.
Let's explore that.
We talk about this a lot in the podcast. It's we can get in our own way a lot. Perfectionism is a pretty common, it's a pretty common human trait, but for academics, it's pretty there. They've got a PhD or something of that nature. And so they're putting out communications, or they're advertising, or so they want to do everything perfect. They want it to look good. They want it to be well researched as well, so we can spend our time in kind of analysis paralysis. And if I've learned anything from being a business owner, especially online, it's way better to get it out there and get some information and data and just and keep going. And the growth and the transformation is really in the taking action. It's not in the theorizing, right? And so the academic can spend all day up there talking about what could be changed, right? The armchair academic, versus actually going and taking action and doing something. And so, but that's been a cool thing to explore with myself, right? And that's, I say this over and over again on the podcast, is I've learned more about myself in 2 years in business than I did with the slow growth of being a teacher. I did tap into my own personal journey as a professor, but it's not a requirement for survival. We're in business, it's you face your shit every day. So that, and it's everything starts coming up. And for me, it's a lot of money issues. There's money issues for me and identity issues. I think in academics as well, we've been looking for lots of outside external validation. That's how the system is set up, right? You have your teacher that gives an A, you have your, dissertation chair, you have the tenure committee, you have the department head. You have all these
So
people
much
telling
stuff.
you. Yeah. So like, we're so used to that. Where in business, it's like, it's kind of just like the dollar. Like you can put something out. If no one buys it, it's not validated. But like, you're not getting judged. The judgment comes in a different way, if that makes sense. So, yeah. So those are some of the things I think of offhand. I probably have more.
Interesting. No, I think that's really interesting. So, so say for example, I know you kind of mentioned some of these earlier. So say someone is like, all right, I have this other passion, or I've kind of thought about what I want my day and my life to look like, and here's what I want, and I'm starting to work on some steps to do that. What have you found from yourself and with kind of speaking with the other guests on the podcast? What are some of the biggest issues that most people find early on, and how do you think to overcome those?
Like in business, like making decisions, like starting a business.
Yes.
Yeah. There are a lot. Most of it, I think, is alluding to what I was saying, is not taking action, because there's so much internal stuff like that we deal with, like psychologically, like, am I enough? Like, will people love me? And so when you put yourself out there and you're creating a product or selling something, I mean, that brings up that stuff front and center. So we can put tasks and to-do lists and maybe software and technology in the way, and use that as a way to be busy and never make a dollar in the business, because we're just like spinning our wheels being like, oh, well, I have to get this ready. And then, so-and-so told me this. So I think it's really hard in the early stages of business, but it's also kind of part of the journey. That what's interesting from like an academic perspective, at least, like there's a lot of people teaching a lot of different strategies out there. So it can be really easy to just like want to all of a sudden start a YouTube channel, and then the next day you need to do a webinar, and then the day after that your webinars are dead. You're supposed to sell high ticket, and there's like all these ways you can make money online. And so navigating that, if you don't trust yourself, you spend a lot of money trying to get answers versus going inward and going back to those questions of like, what do I want? Like, why am I doing this? Like, what's my why behind my business? And if you like, it's easy to basically be like distracted and diverted away from those things. But I do think it's part of the journey, because we do need to learn how to do this stuff. We don't know how to, launch a webinar or like run write some emails in a sales sequence. And so we do need to go for help. So it's about being discerning. And I think what academics do well is we do good research. So we need to figure out what the point is, though, where we're like, okay, now go try. Now go do the lab experiment, because if you don't have any data. So really reframing that, I think, for the academics who are trying to start businesses, I think is smart, I think. I'm trying to think if there's other mistakes. I think we need more than we really need. So a lot of times people are like, oh, well, I must make a website. I should buy a domain. And it's like, the website's important. I mean, it's really important, but it's not going to make you necessarily your first dollar. And in fact, like the way I made some of my first dollars, like were really actually around the personal network that I had created. I started putting myself in a room with certain people, and then was able to build friendships and relationships where people could refer me. And so I was then being referred, and that's how I got my clients. And so I did one-on-one services for the last like 2 years, and recently added a course now, and I'm going to go full into kind of a course business is my plan. But those early stages, it's like you want to learn from your audience, like, how could I actually help people in this niche? Like, who am I helping? What problem am I solving? And figuring that out first is sometimes more important than the website. And so people want to just play with the website and get pretty pictures because they don't have to sell anything. And it's the selling that's like where the business actually is. So it's easy to get ourselves distracted and lost with all the things we feel like we have to do, or I need to be on Twitter, and I need a podcast, and I need to be on Instagram, and I need to be on Facebook. And just even saying that out loud is so tiring and exhausting. So if you can't, you can't do that well. So pick one. So I think those kind of early mistakes are big. I think, I would say those are my biggest, the just doing it when it's not perfect.
Right. What have you thought about time and outsourcing? Because I know we were kind of talking about that kind of in the pre-show, and that's especially with being a podcast host. I did that as soon as I could, really. I mean, I invested in software. There's a lot of automatic automations that you can run in software. So if you're selling one-on-one services, you're going to need a calendar. They're going to need a place to connect with you. We're meeting on Zoom. You can integrate all this stuff so they fire off automatically. You need a way to take payments, so probably PayPal. But even Acuity, which is my favorite calendar planning system, it takes payments. I mean, so you could just have that. And I want to say $9 a month, maybe 10, I think. So, starting out with something like that is not a bad idea. So you can set up all these softwares, and you can invest in some, and the more it takes off your plate, maybe the higher price it might be. But finding a VA, in Upwork, using sites like Upwork, or maybe even tapping into your academic network. There might be some PhD students potentially who want some extra work on the computer. But essentially what you're looking for, I think one of the first things to hire is an assistant that helps with scheduling emails and kind of managing that kind of stuff, basically an executive assistant. And the way to figure that out is through doing a time study. So figuring out what you're doing every single day and timing it out and realizing how much of it is doing and how much of it is, I learned this from Todd Herman. He's the creator of 90 Day Year. He said there are $15 tasks, there are $100 tasks, and there are $1,000 tasks. You need to price out what you're doing in a day-to-day basis. And so $15 tasks are answering emails, maybe making a graphic in Canva, posting on social media or scheduling, things that you could actually really easily hire out. And so once you start to realize, if I fill my day with $15 tasks, I can't make thousands of dollars in the future, and I'm not in the vision space of my business. And if you don't spend at least an hour or two in the vision in the future, then you're just going to get stuck in daily doing every day. And $100 is higher skilled, right? Maybe they know a really crazy software that you would take skills, or they're a high-end designer and stuff like that. So, and that takes, is obviously a lot more pricey. But some of the early days, and I've always had a team member since I think that fall when I was a full-time professor and had a full-time business, I had somebody right away. And she actually has been with me this entire time and did different things. And now my husband is in my business. We have an employee that does a big doing part of my services. So I've kind of always known that the way to really get to the next level is to duplicate myself, or have multiple versions of me and spread that out. And that's super important to getting to the next level for sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, not even just from, a visionary standpoint to make sure you're spending time in that realm to progress things forward, but also, and you kind of mentioned this earlier, making sure you don't spread yourself too thin, and then you end up getting overwhelmed and kind of going on a re-loop. So I think that's a huge point.
Yeah. And we talked about this at our pre-conversation a little bit about burnout. I running a business was way harder than my dissertation was. And I know there's a lot of, I had a beautiful dissertation process, an amazing chair. I actually hired a coach, a dissertation coach, which I know was why I enjoyed the process, but I know that's not the same it's actually not normal, what we would say normal in grad school. It's usually a very grueling time, a very demanding time, and there's not a lot of focus on your health and taking care of yourself. And me running a business last year was in that space. I was way overworked. I was hitting burnout for sure. And I wasn't, and it was because what happened was I'd hired a team. I was getting clients, whatever. And then now I'm managing them. and I'm not in Vision at all. Now I'm like, they're in Slack and messaging me, and like I'm dealing with clients, and I'm trying to do like everything was like I felt behind all the time, and I never could be like in the zone of like creation. And we realized, you know, a couple months even after that I wasn't teaching anymore. So back to like that,
that's your
remember, I was
passion.
really good at it and I loved it. Wait, why did I create a job for myself to leave the academy? Oh yeah, like it was kind of like a mess, right? And so, you know, I think when your business comes through you versus like your money and your livelihood is coming through like your output, to me that totally flipped things. Like I had never, like I'm in office hours, I'm not thinking about how much I'm getting paid spending time with my student, like at all. Like that was never crossed my mind. But in business, it's like you start to think about everything as a time exchange. And so we hired a housekeeper. We started getting a meal service. Like what could we take off our plate at any point in this that would help us be able to be more productive, happy, and have space? And when you have your own business, it's really easy to just work all the time and to never shut it off. Yeah.
Right. Do you feel that even too, like you had said earlier, that academics tend to be perfectionists. Do you feel like that was a big struggle for you as well? Like letting go and letting other people handle these things?
That's an interesting question. Like I like not doing stuff. Like I'm kind of self-aware. Like my husband and I are pretty good. Like it's like, I shouldn't touch that. Like, so there's some things I could say, you know, but not even like I did avoid creating a course for 2 years because I didn't want to create a course on courses because I thought like the magnifying glass would be on like, oh, this better be the best course ever if she's teaching people how to do other courses. That's where I most felt it creep in. But in the day-to-day, not quite. Like, I don't have weird grammar stuff that I'm worried about. Like, I wasn't that kind of nitpicky academic. But so for me, it was less about that and more about the fear of failure, more about like not getting a sale or a result or feeling like I was messing up. And I think that can be tied to perfectionism, right? Like if I don't try, then my like, you know, reputation is protected.
Right.
And it was less about, less about like, oh, I hope the brand is so perfect. Like I'm not controlling in that way, but more in the, how can I avoid it? Like failing like that, which, so yeah.
Interesting. No, that's really, really interesting. Cause I think that's, I mean, obviously, I mean, just because I mean, I've kind of talked with people in different business circles, of course, in the PT realm. I mean, there's a lot of overlap, but also a little bit of some distinct differences at the same time. But that's a very, very common thread. And you've talked on a lot of these too. And it's really, really interesting. So, you know, I'm curious, Lindsay, what has been the most interesting facts or things that you've learned from your guests that you didn't think you would learn that have really changed you as a person and or as a business owner that you haven't already mentioned?
Yeah, I feel like I could, I mean, part of my podcast, I think what I've learned from my guests is that academics we're really smart and and we're valuable to society. We kind of have to like, it's funny because we talk about this too a little bit, like people are kind of unsure what a professor does. And like people are unsure about college, like the cost benefit. I think, you know, there's definitely conversation around that.
Absolutely.
Like, I think it's, so cost versus like what's actually learned. But so there's a lot that, there's a lot changing in this institution that changes relatively slowly. So I think, the folks that are a part of it are, you know, they care about their students. They care about, in most cases, their discipline, and they often care about what's happening in the world. And so we're an important part, like sector of society. And so I love that we're connecting that to business and like making money and having resources. What does it mean when people like us who have that kind of background and that, those values and that worldview, when we have the resources that we can plug back in and like we can, you know, basically alter like the way our culture is right now. I really believe that. And so my guests have like really offered me a lot of inspiration in that, where I'm seeing like how people are harnessing their their skills, their worldview, their heart, like, their care and their emotion and their compassion, I guess is probably the better word, the empathy that they have, and make an impact with a business, because the institution, you can make an impact in a classroom, and it's powerful. That is a powerful place to make an impact, and we need people to keep doing that. But what does it look like when that goes outside? And so to me, like, guest after guest, just like surprising me further and further, from a PhD chemist at Yale whose son gets autism, like an extreme, like is diagnosed with an extreme case of autism, and she does all the research because she's a chemist and can actually study like pharmaceutical and went into that. And she is now saying, like, I need to teach people the leading, because cutting edge articles and research that are happening at academic institutions, but not yet reflected in mainstream practices of taking care of their kids and drugs and all that stuff. And she's like, I just need to teach people about this. And I'm the only person who could do this. And so she started a business, and she's like, I had to, it was my responsibility. So inspiring stuff like that about, if we have this knowledge, what if we're not tied to that classroom space? What if it's bigger than that? And yeah, so that inspiration, it feeds me. And the creativity behind it, a lot of people speak about, so just finding out that others were excited about the creativity of having a business, that you can kind of wake up and make something, is really cool. And so I think just seeing that in others, like seeing their creativity, seeing their passion, has just been invaluable to me. And I think to a lot of my listeners as well, even if they don't want to start a business, it's kind of like, whoa, there are really cool people, out there, doing the thing and making a difference. And so, I think that would be it. Like, they just continue to surprise me with what they've accomplished, and like how, and what they're setting out to do, like what their vision is. Cause I often ask that too, like, where are you going with this business? Because a lot of us are in the growth stages, and that's also really cool to hear. So I'm humbled by that. Like, being able to witness that, is really cool.
Totally. No, and I think that's really, really interesting. And that's not too far off from kind of what we found doing ours as well. Obviously a little bit different, but overall there's definitely some similarity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious because you're, with your business kind of focusing on teaching.
Yeah.
I'd be really curious just to kind of hear, what are your top 3 tips to make the best online course?
Ooh, good question. Don't create any content.
Ooh,
no,
interesting.
Actually, that's my master class that I teach. Yeah. So back to this idea of perfectionism, the people teaching how to create courses right now in this space and sell them, right, for a profit, are marketers, right? So they're like, oh, I have this knowledge and I'll just package it and then I'll like sell it to you and then you'll learn stuff. And they're like, done. And I'm like, wait. And so what I realized is I was following their lead and being like, oh yeah, all the slides have to be ready and all the worksheets and, the videos have to be 5 minutes because adults, whatever, like, right? Oh, it has to be there's all these different learning styles, audios and blah, blah, blah. And so anyways, it can get intense. And that's not even when you have students. That's all pre stuff, right? So I definitely teach pre-selling, which is this idea of don't create anything, sell it, make sure people want it, and then give it to them in a couple weeks, right? And tell them like, okay, cool, I'm going to like make this with you. Here's where I'm different though, because I'm not the first person to say that. I am the first person, however, to say, don't even create slides or anything on the other side of it, that you don't need to buy this fancy software that houses your course until you actually are sure who's going to show up and what they really need from you, and for you to teach live. So of course the professor who taught in a live, like face-to-face classroom is going to be able to share how what they thought they were planning to teach when it didn't happen, because who knows what, they adapted, right? And so it was this aha moment I had actually beginning of this year that was stopping people from putting it out. Just like I said, early stages, if they thought if they knew, and they did, how much time and energy it took to create the course, it prevented them from doing it. And then their deeper fears was, is anyone going to buy? Who am I to teach this? Will they actually get a transformation? Will they learn anything? Will they get what I promise? Those are their inner fears about what, am I a good enough teacher? Am I good enough for them? Right. And then they pay me money. I have to like deliver. Right. So they just don't get their course out there and they put up all these excuses. And so I was like, look, the value of your course is in you and them together. You, your students, and some shit, Okay, great. So show up for a workshop in Zoom and teach. So I'm not saying don't prep. Like, you're going to be organized. Make a lecture outline, right? Show up and teach a workshop. Show up the next week and teach a workshop. And so basically you teach your course live with live students interacting, asking questions. So you can really get that feedback, right? And then you outline your course after those videos. You watch them back, you get them transcribed, and you say, oh, that was a good point. Everyone's head, right? You're basically watching yourself teach, which is something I had to do as a professor, early stage, like, right? Watch videos of you. And so you're watching yourself teach, and then you're like, oh, this was really powerful. Or, ooh, I didn't have like an explanation or an analogy here, so I kind of lost people. Or I flew past this too quickly, so they didn't get it. And so you can witness that, and then you can record those 5-minute perfect videos. They're not going to be perfect, but like that round. And basically the structure of your course starts taking shape, and it's based on student feedback, not on what you think they need to know. So that's my biggest, like, that is arguably the biggest thing that, like, the problem I see in the industry is everyone's trying to create the course ahead of time, and it actually burns them in the end, because if they truly cared about the learning experience, they're going to edit it, because you have to get, as a better you get better basically every time you teach something. So if you don't make it easily editable for yourself, you're just going to let it sit there and be like, oh yeah, that one module, they all get stuck there. Oh, that's a bummer. I'll just like cheer them on or like hope they get it. And it's like, maybe they're getting stuck because of the way it's set up. Like, you're going to have to go back and re-record it, right? So that's my big one. Other ones are things like, putting too much content in is very typical, but I think it's easier to weed stuff out after you've taught it live. And so you can make things shorter and more concise because you've done it once and you can like actually see where people were going. And then I think the other one is not charging enough. I think a lot of people like are really anxious about charging and appropriately. And I think for a beta, which is that first run of a course, it actually is like probably even a better experience and more valuable for a student to be live with their professor than it is for them to get a video and a worksheet. So you should be able to sell that at a higher price possibly. And so I think one mistake is that people don't think it's valuable if they're running through it for the first time, and that's not really true. And it's all about how you really frame and think about what you're doing, and you're showing up live for them in a setting where they can ask you anything at any time and get your expert feedback. And in the future iteration of your course, it likely won't be like that. So if you center on how valuable that is, their interaction with you, then you'll start to realize that your course is actually really valuable. And so people tend to underprice, and you'd be surprised to hear that like underpricing your course can actually turn people away. It's like,
right,
oh, yeah. if they're like doing, 8 weeks of one-on-one calls and like they're planning, I'm going to lose £1 billion and it's $5. It's like, I don't trust. That sounds like a scam, right? Like, but if you have to give some actual, a decent amount of cash, you're going to be invested in a different way. So underpricing can have a negative impact for sure.
Oh, totally. I mean, that makes complete sense. Like, think about it, like the more you pay, the more invested you are, and you're going to do whatever you put the money down is. It also shows confidence on the seller's end. Like, I know what I have is valuable, take it or leave it. Like, that is what it is. So
and that's that scary piece, because the biggest fear is that no one's going to buy, and they put it out there. And this is even after they haven't created anything, but people are so scared to just even make the offer of hearing, that no one wants it. And we equate that with our value in ourselves, which isn't true. So that's another kind of big part of it. So that's why we sometimes try to make it fancy, so it feels better that we're charging more. And that's really hurting you and your students, to be honest.
Right. It's like you don't have to focus on that. It's just focus on
No,
the main
exactly.
thing. Yeah, that's
Teaching, getting them the
Yeah.
results, building that core, like class community.
Right.
That's the key.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. Access to healthcare is one of the largest issues facing both providers and patients, as millions of people worldwide lack timely and affordable access to healthcare. Anywhere Healthcare, a telehealth platform, is a simple, low-cost option for providers and patients that eliminates the barriers to access to all kinds of healthcare. To find out more, check out anywhere.healthcare, which is available on our show notes. And if you use the code HET in all caps when you email to sign up, you'll save 25% off the total cost. Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.